Yotam Ottolenghi, welcome to Booktopia.
Thank you very much.
Now let's just imagine a scenario where, imagine for a moment that you were kind of Angelina Jolie or Emma Watson, and you've been invited to the United Nations, except you haven't been invited to make a speech. You've been invited to cook something that can bring long-standing enemies, hardcore foe, together. What would you cook at the United Nations in the spirit of peace?
Gosh, that's a hard question. Well, I think in a spirit of peace, I wouldn't cook one thing. I cook many things, and I think it's very important to acknowledge that you need diversity on the table, right? I mean, if I would cook one thing, not everybody would like it. So I would have to do a table full of wonderful delights. And most of it would have to be vegetarian, not to offend anybody. And I would start with a big plate of mejadara, which is rice and lentils, Arabic rice and lentils with lots of fried onion and yogurt spooned on top. That is really kind of, I don't think anyone would challenge that's like the ultimate comfort food. It's delicious, and most cultures like that. I do a nice plate of roasted tomatoes with some grain folded through, maybe bulgur wheat, maybe some giant couscous, something along those lines. A bit of acidity, but mainly for the color. Perhaps I will do something with Swiss chard or with spinach, because I think those are just wonderful flavors, and I'd like a bit of green, and it's kind of hearty and earthy and something quite substantial. I can go on forever, but I think the idea of having different colors, different textures just next to each other would probably symbolize a certain aspiration for harmony among different peoples.
You studied philosophy before you went into the food business, so you obviously, given that you come from Israel originally, you must have thought long and hard about how it is that cultures that live together, so close together, and actually eat the same food, whatever they call it, are at loggerheads. Do you see any prospect of peace through the act of breaking bread?
I would love to think that yes, but I think the answer is no. Unfortunately, if I need to be realistic, I think that it takes a lot of goodwill to bring down those walls between Jews and Arabs in Israel and Palestine, and food would just not be enough. Unfortunately, if we need to be extremely realistic. However, I think once people sit together, they'll have a great feast, because they both like delicious food and they both know how to make food very, very delicious. So I think if you just get them started, the food will do the rest. But first, everybody needs to sit down and agree to talk and to kind of come off their high horses.
Yeah, and that's the hard bit. Now, in Plenty More, there are lots of fantastic new recipes. And what's lovely is the way you often acknowledge the source of the recipe that you've then tweaked or reinterpreted. And I'm wondering, how important do you think authorship is with recipes? How important is it for someone to say, this is my recipe? Is there such a thing?
I tend to doubt that there is such a thing, that a recipe that belongs to someone. I mean, it goes, talking back about my background and coming from Jerusalem, which is a city very much divided between two conflicting sides. There's a lot of discussion about who owns what and who was the first to make or discover. And normally these discussions are pretty futile, and they also don't lead anywhere. I mean, they are a place where people kind of draw the battle lines, but
yes,
they're not kind of there to kind of bring a constructive solution to anything. And about recipe writers, I mean, if we take that kind of comparison to people, I think nobody actually invents anything. I mean, we live in a world where, we're all constantly exposed to other people's food through meeting them, seeing them, social media, TV, everything. So you're constantly inspired by and affected by your colleagues. So when I look at a recipe, I always try to think, how did that start? How did that come to be? So if it's something that I had in a street corner sitting down in Malaysia, I think, I'll tell the story because that's what inspired the dish. And if I go through a magazine and look through a colleague's recipe, so that's a great idea. I'd like to use that as a starting point for my recipe. Then I like to tell the story. it's very difficult to claim that any one of my ideas is purely mine. So I'd rather tell it as it is than try to kind of forget where the thought came from.
I love the fact that in this book as well, you acknowledge that when you're making things for television, they don't always automatically go right on the first take, that it might take 2 or 3 takes to get something right. And obviously the recipes that we see in the book are all successful recipes that work. I want to know about experiments that have failed. Tell me about a time when you tried to put 2 ingredients together and you tasted it and you went, yuck, that's awful.
Well, look, often the great ideas are fine on paper, but once it comes to cooking, they just don't work. And I have had kind of quite a few experiences where things just, didn't work, and then you put them to one side. But more often than not, you take something and you kind of reinterpret it and make it work in a different context. So I'll give you one example that I've the other day I was gonna try and do something. I was gonna say like my take on a few English classics. So I was going to do an Eccles cake. Eccles cake is puff pastry, kind of small cake that is stuffed with currants and normally is eaten with cheese. And it's a quintessential, British dish. And I thought I'll do something similar and give it my own touch. So my idea was, after we tried it and it worked well, we just did the traditional one, is to make it in the shape of give it a rectangular shape because nobody eats round, and call it an Eccles cake Pop-Tart. So you can put it in your toaster and finish baking it in your toaster, and then eat it. So it's kind of an immediate Eccles cake. But it didn't work because the pastry was so delicious and good that it melted in the toaster and ruined our toaster. So we had to rethink it because we loved the pastry, but it just didn't hold standing up. So we went back to the round shape and to not going in the toaster. But then I thought, okay, let's change the filling a little bit. And what came to mind is rugelach, which is a Jewish crescent-shaped little sweet. You can get them in North America, also in Israel, they're an Eastern European thing. And in America, they put nuts and jam and cinnamon in them. They're really, really delicious. The shortest pastry. So I thought, let's do the Eccles cake, but do a rugelach filling. So we got our beautiful pastry that we developed. It works really well. It's got lard. It's completely decadent. But we'll use the rugelach filling, so we'll give that a touch. So it started as one thing, and ended up being similar thing, but through a process. And those things we do every day.
Yeah.
Sometimes I take a stuffing and turn it into the main thing, or vice versa. If something goes into a mush, I go, oh, let's stuff a vegetable with that. So, it takes you need to be a bit creative and think outside the box, and then most often you can make use of your failures.
And one of the things that I think really comes through in Plenty More is that you're not operating solo, that this is very much a book where you're acknowledging not only the influences of other people, but your team. And so in a way, you've kind of shifted, in my perception, from being a soloist to being the conductor of an orchestra.
It's nice of you to say that. I have always been a great collaborator. That's my strong point. I don't like giving myself many compliments, but since we started Ottolenghi, it's always been a group effort. There's four partners. Sami got quite a lot of attention, Sami Tamimi, who's co-authored 2 books with me. But it's always been the 4 of us, and there's been other creative people, forces in the team. And I've always tried to whenever I'm in an interview, I say, actually, it's not only me. There's like her and him, and that's her recipe, and but nobody's interested. They want one name, one face. So I've always been collaborating, but this time with Plenty More, I thought I'm going to tell it as it is. We've got a test kitchen. There's a group of us. We brainstorm, we taste, we have a good dynamic, and I was trying to tell that story in the introduction. And I think it's great for the recipes.
It is. The other thing that's changed, another big thing that's changed since your last book, Plenty, is that you've become a father. And I was wondering whether your attitude to food has changed as a result of being a parent, because now you're invested in getting your child to eat, and that's not always easy. You can't always get children to eat what you enjoy as an adult.
Yeah. Well, I think it's too early for me to give advice to to parents about how to get their kids to eat things, because our son is not even 2 years old, and I think it becomes more difficult later. It's so far it's been okay.
I'm sure he's ahead of everybody else
Oh,
in terms of his
don't say that.
taste.
He has been fed the most unusual things at a very early age, because I bring all the stuff from the test kitchen, even the things that don't really work, and I go like, let's see how Max reacts to that. So he's a proper guinea pig for all sorts of weird and wonderful things. But he's got a taste of his own. So although he's very open, he has this thing that he loves green things and he hates red things. God knows why. He eats peas and beans and cucumbers, but you put a tomato in front of him, it's on the floor.
There are green tomatoes.
Yeah, there are green tomatoes. That's a good idea. I think they'll be too sharp for him. But
Yes.
you know, he takes the tomato and just off the tray onto the floor. No room for negotiations. You know, that's how it is. But since he eats, as I see it with children and their eating, I think we often project our anxieties over their eating habits. Mm-hmm. And I notice with our son, sometimes when I don't look, he eats much better than when I look. So I turn my back and I do something else, and all of a sudden the food's done. And when I sit there, look what he's doing, then he kind of plays with that and decides not to eat. So I think we should kind of, I try now as a lesson from that to disengage from his eating process. I put the food there and go and do something else, and actually I think that works quite well for me.
Has your own palate changed? Because I know that you started very much at the sweet end of the spectrum. When you started to cook, you were making pastry and you were making sweets, but I feel that the balance in Plenty More is very much more emphasizing the savoury, which
Yes.
is my favourite part of the sort of food spectrum. So have you developed more, do you think, of a savoury palate?
In terms of my training, I've actually the whole early years of me in kitchens was always in the pastry department. So I was a pastry cook, and I did things that I loved doing. You know, croissants and pain au chocolat and beautiful cakes and tarts. And my heart is still very much there. But my training and then when I started Ottolenghi, I expanded, and through the work with Sammy and others, I've become more and more of a savory cook as well as a patisserie cook. And now I bake much less than I did before. I don't know if my palate expanded, but it's definitely my repertoire expanded, and I do cook much more savory food now. But I really love both. At some point, I'm going to do a pastry book as well in the future, and I think it's good to have, you know, your fingers in all pies.
Do you pay much attention, Yotam, to the latest kind of diet fads, you know, to the question about whether or not we should be eating meat, and, you know, the new thing, which obviously is that fat is good, hooray, but that sugar is the enemy? Do you listen to that going on in the sort of, you know, in the sort of public conversation and adjust your thinking to those trends, or not at all?
I listen, but I get really angry. Because I get really upset when people come up with a new thing, because I've been through so many things. I always doubt how long this is going to last. And I've written a piece for The Guardian recently about this new kind of, you can eat fat. And I've always been eating fat, and I've always been eating sugars, and I've always been eating vegetables. And I think once you start thinking that there is one solution that fits all, you're bound to be thinking of another solution in 1 or 2 or 3 years' time. And I really think that it's completely not sensible to hang everything on one thing, on one solution. I think it's commonsensical, it sounds almost banal, that you should eat a balanced diet, but anything else just doesn't work for me. You know, it's like you should eat a little bit of everything, and then you're going to be fine. I always ate butter, I always had animal fat, I always had tons of olive oils, and I always had lots of good vegetables. I don't see any problem with that. It's just the way it should be.
Yotam Ottolenghi, thank you very much.
Thank you.